Riley Warren, everybody, give him a hand. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the CrossWalk Podcast. Today you just have me, and I'm going to be talking about why the Quran is untrustworthy. There are a lot of different reasons. One of the biggest categories the Quran fails at is historical contradictions, places where it contradicts history. And so if you want to know about that, you'll have to look at my co-host Riley Warren. He put an episode on that. Should be, I don't know if it's coming out before or after this one, but that should be on the YouTube channel. Today I'm going to focus on other areas where the Quran contradicts the Bible. As you may remember, last month we put out a video going over the religion of Islam and going over places where Islam contradicts Christianity and places where it isn't logically coherent, places where it doesn't make sense. So today, instead of rehashing all we talked about in Islam, I want to focus directly on Islam's holy book, that is the Quran. Now, before we get started, I want to give you a brief history of the Quran and where it came from. Generally, it's believed by Muslims that it came about between the years 610 and 632 AD, where the Prophet Muhammad received revelations from the angel, I think it was the angel Gabriel. So over these 23 years, he received these different revelations from God through Gabriel that became the Quran. Now, however, something very important that we need to remember is when Muhammad received these revelations, they weren't formalized into a book form. Basically, the way the history of the Quran went was that he would receive the revelation, and then it would be memorized by his followers. And that's how the Quran survived. It survived through memorization. There was no final order tradition like we have today. It was all through oral tradition. It'd be remembered orally, it'd be memorized, it'd be spoken. However, after Muhammad died, this system worked for while he was alive. People would memorize the Quran, that's how it would be preserved. But once he died, there was somewhat of a panic. Because what they discovered was, without Muhammad, they then were the only ones who knew the Quran. They were the only ones who remembered it. And what was happening was, as they were fighting, because after Muhammad's death, there was a large period of time where Muslims were fighting a lot with other people. They were attacking, they were defending. There was a lot of battles going on. And the people that were tasked with memorizing the Quran were dying. And they were dying off. What they were realizing was, as these memorizers die off, parts of the Quran were dying with them, because no one else remembered them. And so, the best they could do was start writing things down. They did the best they could. They started writing down on, I think my notes say, leather, pottery, leaves, stones, bones. They wrote down whatever they could so they wouldn't have to worry about losing it. Finally, a committee collected all of the scraps, all the memories into one single manuscript. However, this did not last very long. Over the years, many different versions came out because different people would remember things a little differently. They'd remember different parts. They'd remember things said differently, stuff like that. And so there's many different versions of the Quran that exist in this time period. And that's when something called the First thing I want to say, moving forward, I'm probably going to say every single name wrong. Because this is the first Islam episode, I apologize for that. I do not know how to say these names. It looks like his name is Uthman, something like that. Basically what happened was, there's all these different versions, and there was this big dispute over which one to use. And so, this man, Uthman, he basically took all the versions, and he made one official one that they deemed was what it should be. They took all the Quran versions there were, and they actually destroyed every single copy of the Quran that disagreed with the one they had chosen as the standard. And that is sort of, I guess, as close as you can imagine to the Quran we have today. Now, that being said, that's kind of the history of the Quran. It started as just these revelations given to Muhammad in a cave. It was memorized, spoken orally, and then it was eventually written down. It became very varied. There's a lot of There's a lot of variation in it. And then eventually this man compiled it all into one and destroyed all of the variants. However, that's not the end of the history of the Quran, because today you will find there are still many different versions of the Quran. There are so many different translations, there are different compilations, and there are different versions of it that have very different meanings. So, I just want to get that out of the way so you can understand the history of the Quran before we go into why it is untrustworthy. Now, number two, I also want to mention what Islam teaches about the Quran, because this is very important, and this comes down to why this is such an important discussion. Because Islam teaches several things. They teach that the Quran was uncreated and that it existed eternally with Allah. They believe that it is verbatim, that every word and sound is the direct speech of Allah. They believe it is perfect, there's no contradictions or errors. They believe that it's been preserved word for word, identical, since the 600s when Muhammad originally received revelations. And they believe that it is the final revelation which confirms previous scriptures like the Torah, the Gospels, and so on. So, if a single contradiction, textual change, or human source can be proven to have influenced the Quran or be present in the Quran, what that means is that the core claim of Islam collapses. Because Islam is built on three things. I've heard it said that Islam is like a three-legged stool. Mecca, Muhammad, and the Quran. Without those three things, Islam cannot exist. And because of the way, as people don't really use three-legged stools, but I think you can imagine it. If you take one leg away, the stool will fall. And that's how Islam is. So if you can prove that there's either a contradiction, there's a textual change, or that the Quran relied on some human source, then you can prove that Islam is not a valid religion because one of their core claims is false. So now let's go into a few areas that I want to talk about today where the Quran is wrong, where you can see that the Quran has contradictions, it has errors, and so forth. The first is the internal contradictions and inconsistencies, which is the main thing I want to talk about. This is like the main core of my argument. Okay, so the first contradiction or inconsistency in the Quran is about the doctrine of abrogation, which is the doctrine that Allah replaces His own eternal words. The Quran teaches this in Surah 2, 106. It says, we replace or cause to be forgotten whatever verse we will. And Surah 16, verse 101 says, Allah substitutes one revelation for another. That teaches something very simple. We talked about this in the last episode, that the teachings of the Quran can be different in the beginning and the end, because Islam teaches that a teaching can be overwritten, essentially, by Allah. However, in the Quran, it also claims in Surah 6, verse 115, none can change His words, and Surah 10, verse 64, no change can be found in the words of Allah. So, the question becomes, how can the teachings of Allah be changed? They can be abrogated, they can be overwritten, but the Quran says that they can't. I've butchered that. Basically, the Quran says two things that contradict. The Quran says, oh no, the Quran, the words can't change. Allah's words cannot be changed. They are perfect, they're set, they're preserved, they're unchanging. But it also says that Allah's commands can be changed through the doctrine of abrogation, which is the first contradiction I wanted to mention. A few examples of this would be the direction of prayer. The early command, which was implied in Surah 2, verse 115, was that Muslims were to pray towards Jerusalem. But then, in the same surah, verse 144, the command is that they should pray towards Mecca. So the command changed. Allah's first command, while they believe it was true at that time period, it got overwritten and replaced. Allah's words were not permanent and they were changed. Another example is alcohol. In Surah 16, verse 67, it is allowed. You're allowed to drink alcohol in the Quran. However, in Surah 4, verse 43, it then teaches that you shouldn't drink alcohol near a time when you're going to pray. And then finally, in Surah 590, the teaching changes completely, and the Quran actually teaches then that it's forbidden, and no Muslim should drink alcohol. That's another clear example of places where Allah's words changed. His commands were changed. If Allah's words were perfect, then they wouldn't need to be changed. Another one is the Quran teaches that creation was in 6 days, but it also teaches that creation was in 8 days. Surah 41, verse 9 through 12, if you do the math, you read through that and you add up all the different categories, you find that the earth was created in 8 days in the Quran. However, in Surah 754, 10 verse 3, 11 verse 7, and 25 verse 59, you'll find that the Quran also says it was created in 6 days. How could the earth have been created in 8 days if it was also explicitly created in 6 days? That's not a simple little, it's just a discrepancy, it can be explained away. That's not something you can explain away. That's a clear case where the Quran contradicts itself. And that cannot stand in a book that is claimed to be perfect. Another one, it has very confusing teaching on who the first true Muslim was. The Quran identifies four individuals as the first Muslim. Muhammad in Surah 6, verse 163. Moses in Surah 7, 143 through 144. And Abraham in Surah 3, 67. Also, Jesus' disciples in Surah 3:52. How is it possible that all of these people were the first Muslim? When not only are they different people, they lived in wildly different centuries. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of years apart. How could they all have been the first Muslim? That's a very clear contradiction within the Quran. Another is whether Allah is visible or not. Surah 603 says, vision perceives him not, but Surah 75:22-23 says, believers will look at their Lord. If Allah is invisible, then how can his believers look at him? The Quran is a very confusing book in this sense. I mean, as you're seeing, there's all kinds of places where it clearly contradicts itself because it is not a perfect book. It is not a holy book. It is a book that was written by a man, compiled by men, who then altered it to fit what they wanted it to be when Uthman created his Quran. Number 5, this is the most debated probably of all of the contradictions I want to bring up, and that is Allah being a deceiver. Surah 3 verse 54 says, let me just look it up real quick, because this is one of the most important ones. This is the example you'll find the most when you're looking at examples of places where the Quran is wrong. You'll find this all the time. In this translation of the Quran, it says, and the unbelievers plotted and planned, and Allah too planned, and the best of planners is Allah. And that verse at face value seems normal. However, what you'll find if you actually look at the Arabic, which, let me make something clear, I cannot read Arabic. I know absolutely nothing about it, but I did a lot of research. What I found was the word planner in that verse literally means deceiver. The literal translation of that verse is that Allah is the best of deceivers. Now, however, other verses in the Quran say that Allah's words are perfectly true. It is logically contradictory for someone known as the best deceiver to also be the perfect source of truth. That's simply impossible. That is a contradiction. Are Christians and Jews friends or not? Surah 5:51 says not to befriend them, while Surah 5:82 and 68 says be kind and they're closest in affection. Those are opposite commands. Number 7, free will or predestination. Surah 18:29 says whoever wills, let him believe. And Surah 2 verse 256 says there is no compulsion. That implies humans have free will. However, in Surah 1693, it teaches that Allah misleads those who he chooses to. And then Surah 10 verse 100 says no one can believe unless Allah wills them to. So in the Quran, do humans have free will, or does Allah ultimately decide all? That's another contradiction. It teaches both things. They're mutually incompatible. Do Allah's words change or not? We talked about this earlier. Surah 10:64 teaches they don't change, while Surah 206 teaches they do. Does Allah forgive everything? Does he forgive all sins? So Surah 39:53 teaches that Allah forgives all sins, while Surah 4:48 teaches that he does not forgive shirk. What we find there is that Allah does not forgive all sins, but then it also says he does forgive all sins. That's another clear example of a contradiction. Surah 11:1 teaches that the Quran is perfected and explained in detail. It is clear. While Surah 3:7 teaches that some verses in the Quran are only known to Allah. I don't know why I can't say that right. That's another contradiction. Is the Quran clear or unclear? That's a clear example of a contradiction in the Quran. The order of creation. Surah 2:29 teaches the earth was created first, while Surah 79:27-30 teaches the heavens were created first. Both can't be true. Are angels perfectly obedient? Surah 16:50 teaches that angels are perfectly obedient, while Surah 2:34 teaches that disobedient angels exist, angels that don't obey. So are angels obedient or not? The Quran clearly has a contradiction in it. Was Muhammad sinful or sinless? In Surah 47:19 and 48:2, it teaches that he needs forgiveness. While in Surah 33:21, it teaches that he is a perfect example. How can he be a perfect example if he was a sinful man, if he was a sinner? That's a contradiction. Does the sun set in a muddy spring? Riley talked about in his episode, I encourage you to go watch that, he mentioned that the Quran teaches that Alexander the Great found the setting of the sun, or where the sun sets. Another thing I found interesting was that in Surah 1886, it teaches that the sun sets in a muddy spring, which I don't even understand what that's intended to mean. Let me see if I can find the verse here. Surah 1886, here it is. It says, until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it set in a spring of murky water. Literally, he's teaching this man, he's on a journey, and he finds where the sun sets, and it sets in a mud puddle. Now, I don't even know if I can call that a contradiction. It's just something really that's not true. Actually, it is a contradiction, I forgot, because Surah 21:33 describes that the sun moves in an orbit. It describes the way the world actually does work. And it's fascinating to see how the Quran interacts with itself. Because as I've given you tons of examples, I have a few more, that all of these different verses contradict with each other. And it's just so interesting to find in a book like this, because they claim the Quran is perfect, it has no errors. And so if you can find one error in the Quran, like the one they've demonstrated, even if Muslims can explain away all of them, if only one stands true, then my point is made. Because I don't need to prove that every verse in the Quran is wrong. Because of the way their doctrine is, I only need to prove one is wrong, and their entire doctrine of the Quran crumbles. Number 16, the Quran in Surah 248 and 2:123 teaches that intercession is not allowed. You are not to intercess. While Surah 20, verse 109 and 34:23 teach that intercession is in fact allowed. Surah 15:26 teaches that Adam was created from clay, while Surah 3:59 teaches he was created from dust. Surah 19:67 teaches he was created from nothing. And Surah 21:30 teach that he was created from water. Those are not something that's not something that can be harmonized. He wasn't created from clay, dust, nothing, and water. That doesn't work. He can only have been created from one. So therefore, the Quran has a clear, demonstrable contradiction. How long is a day to Allah? Surah 22:47 teaches that to Allah a day is 1,000 years, while it teaches in 70, verse 4, that is 50,000 years. Is the earth flat or spherical? I found this one interesting. The Quran apparently in Surah 78:6, 88:20, and 15:19 teaches that the earth is flat and spread out, while in 39:5 it describes it as something that is fitting with a sphere, or as we know the earth to be round, not flat. It describes the cycles of night and today, which implies a round earth. That would work with a flat earth. Finally, are there 1 or 7 heavens? Surah 2, verse 29 teaches there's 1 heaven, while Surah 17:44, 23:86, and 67:3 teach that there are 7 heavens. That's a direct contradiction. So that's the main body of this episode. That's what I'm going to talk about mainly, because Muslims believe something very specific about the Quran. And if you can prove there's an error in the Quran, then you can prove the Quran is not from Allah. And if the Quran is not from Allah, they can't trust anything it says, and they have no reason to believe Muhammad was a prophet. If they have no reason to believe Muhammad was a prophet, then there is no religion of Islam. Which is why I think it's so important that as Christians, we are aware of some of the problems of the Quran so we can better witness to our Muslim neighbors. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is the origins of some of the things within the Quran. Because this is something that I found fascinating, and I want to encourage you all to go listen to a podcast episode. Actually, let me find it real quick, because I find this podcast explained this better than I ever could. It was with a man who spent a great deal of time studying Islam and the Quran, and he did some studies into where the Quran came from. Okay, the episodes are called Why the Foundations of Islam Are Now Crumbling with Dr. Jay Smith on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast. There's 2 parts. I encourage you to go listen to both. Make clear, I don't necessarily agree with everything they say in the episodes. I don't agree with everything in that podcast. But there are very good episodes that give very concrete examples of why the Quran can't be trusted and how we know that it was, in fact, plagiarized, largely by Muhammad. So I want to talk about that a little bit now. Because one of the things you'll find in... What you'll find in the Quran when you look at stories about Jesus and the disciples is that almost all of the stories in the Quran actually don't come from the canonical Gospels. They don't come from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They come from the Gnostic Gospels and the other heretical, apocryphal Gospels that weren't accepted. And there's a reason for this. In Muhammad's lifetime, the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they had not been translated into Arabic. They were written in Greek, but they're written in Greek and translated into Syriac, but Muhammad could not read either. Arabia lacked widespread literacy and had almost no full Bible manuscripts. However, the Gnostic Gospels we have some evidence that the Gnostic Gospels, which are directly referenced in the Quran, were translated into Arabic. Now, this doesn't necessarily prove that he plagiarized. But what we find is that it is very consistent with him plagiarizing, because he never uses stories from the canonical Gospels because he couldn't access them. So he wouldn't have had any knowledge of them. The stories he does reference in the Quran are all from stories that he could have encountered because they had been translated into his language. This at least seems to indicate that the Quran wasn't some divine revelation from Allah. It was him putting to paper what he knew from his own experience. Some of the Gospels, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Arabic infancy Gospel, Pseudo-Matthew, Gnostic desert traditions, Syrian Christian folklore, and then Jewish midrash and folklore circulating in Arabia. Those were some of the sources that we find directly used in the Quran that he had in his language, which explains why we don't find stories from the canonical Gospels. Here's a couple examples. The Quran teaches that baby Jesus speaks from the cradle. Quran in Surah 19 verses 29 through 33 teach this. This is not found in the Gospels, but it is found in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. Jesus creates birds from clay. It's found in the Quran in chapter 3 verse 49. It is not in the Bible, but it is in the Arabic infancy Gospel. Mary gives birth under a palm tree. The Quran teaches this in chapter 19, 22 through 26. It is not found in the Bible, but it is found in the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, which is most likely someone who claims to be Matthew but was not. Many Jesus' miraculous childhood stories are not in the Bible. However, they are in the Quran, and they are in the apocryphal Gospels. People of the cave, I don't understand exactly what this one was anymore. I don't remember, but the Quran teaches about the cave sleepers, people of the cave, in chapter 18, verses 9 to 26, which is identical to Christian folklore about the same thing. It is not found in the Bible. Solomon talking to animals and controlling jinn is found in the Quran, chapter 27, 16 through 19, and Surah 34, 12 through 14. It is not in the Bible, but it is in Jewish folklore. Quran 18, 83 through 98, this is interesting, teaches about Alexander the Great, which obviously is not in the Bible, but it does directly draw from ancient literature about Alexander the Great. Now, this proves that the Quran is not divine, because what we find is that it's not what he claimed to be. He claimed that it was some divine revelation, and he only knew about these stories because Allah had revealed them to him. But in reality, we find that can't be true, because the only stories he used are ones that he directly had access to, and stories he didn't have access to are not included in the Quran. A divine eternal book would not depend on the apocryphal Gospels, and a perfect revelation wouldn't contain contradictions. The universal revelation would not rely on folklore, it wouldn't rely on apocrypha, while contradicting the actual scriptures in order to make his book. If this was a real, inspired revelation from Allah or God, it would not draw from these sources. Now, I just have a little bit I want to discuss now. Two more things mainly, and those are a scientific critique of the Quran, why it is wrong, proof is wrong scientifically, and then a moral critique of the Quran. So, here's a few examples of places where the Quran describes things that contradict science or the established observable world that we live in. Number one, it teaches the sun sets in a muddy spring. That guy mentioned that earlier. That's a weird one. Surah 1886, he found it setting in a spring of muddy water. That is clearly not true. That is mythology, not astronomy. It teaches the earth is flat, as we said, in Surah 78:6, 88:20, 15:19, but we know that the earth is spherical. That was a contradiction from before. Surah 21, verse 31, teaches that mountains prevent earthquakes. It says, we place mountains lest the earth should shake with them. Surah 16:15 teaches the same thing. However, we know that mountains do not, in fact, prevent earthquakes. They're actually caused by them. He had it backwards. Stars are missiles thrown at demons. Surah 37, 6-10, stars are described as missiles used to drive away the devils. And Surah 67:5 teaches that stars are stones hurled at the demons. However, we know that stars are actually enormous balls of burning gas. They are not missiles or stones being thrown at demons. This comes from folklore, not science. And if it came from divine revelation, then it would not contradict science so clearly in this way. Surah 71, 15-16 teaches that the moon gives off its own light. Quran, Surah 10:5 also speaks of the moon shining as its own light source. However, the moon does not produce light, as we know. It simply reflects the sunlight of the sun. If the Quran was from Allah, if it was from God, who claims to be all-knowing, it would not have these basic errors. It teaches a layered earth that matches the seven heavens. Surah 65:12, Allah created 7 heavens, and of the earth the like of them. Earth does not have 7 layers comparable to 7 heavens mentioned in the Quran. This reflects what's called a stacked layer cosmology, which apparently was quite common in the ancient world, but we know now is not true. The sun and the moon travel in orbits around the earth. This Surah 21:33 teaches the sun and the moon each run in an orbit. In early Islamic cosmology, they understood that the sun orbits the earth and the moon orbits the sun. However, we happen to know that the moon orbits the earth and the earth orbits the sun. This has all of its astronomy backwards. They teach that the sky is a solid physical structure like a dome. Surah 21:32 teaches we made the sky a protected ceiling. We know the sky is not a solid dome. And then finally, mountains acting like pegs to hold the earth still. This is very similar to the verse about mountains preventing earthquakes. Surah 78:6-7 teaches, and the mountains as pegs. This connects the idea that mountains fix the earth in place. They hold it down. So, we know from science, mountains do not peg into the earth to stabilize it. That's simply not true. So, the Quran claims to be perfect, flawless, and divine. However, it contradicts itself. It clearly draws off of folklore and apocryphal sources. It's scientifically inaccurate to the point of being laughable in some places. And then finally, it is morally reprehensible in some of the things that it teaches. Now, obviously, as my co-hosts were discussing earlier, different people tend to draw their view of morality from the religion they come from. So Islamic people, Muslims, will tend to view these things very differently than someone who's, say, a Christian. However, everyone is born with a conscience. The Holy Spirit gives each of us the ability to tell right from wrong, whether they are saved or a Christian or not. And so it should be clear that these are wrong. Number one, their treatment of women. Quran in Surah 4:11 assigns women half the inheritance of men, regardless of merit or responsibility. It teaches that they are inferior in worth. In Surah 2:282, it says that 2 women or 4 women equal in the case of financial matters, 2 women equal the testimony of 1 man. They're only half. And if I remember correctly, in the case of adultery, it required 4 women to equal the testimony of 1 man. Marriage and authority. Surah 4:34 allows men to discipline disobedient wives, implying male superiority. However, we also know, I don't remember exactly, this was in the Hadith where Muhammad actually encouraged husbands to beat their wives. I mean, Islam is not the peaceful religion that people claim it is. It is a very violent religion in a lot of senses, and that's what a lot of the problems I have with the Quran is because it teaches things that are morally wrong. Number 2, slavery. The Surah 4:24, 23:5-6, 70:30 allows for those who take slaves and captives to mistreat them and have inappropriate relations with these slaves, to essentially rape their own slaves. That's what the Quran teaches and allows and even encourages. That is morally reprehensible and wrong. And while it provides some guidance for how you should treat slaves, not to kill them or anything like that, it never says that slavery is wrong. Now, people will point and say, the Bible mentions slavery too, you can't say that's wrong. The Bible never encourages people to mistreat their slaves. The Bible actually, in the book of Philemon, Paul encourages a slave owner to release a slave who is a Christian and to treat him as a brother. Number 3, punishment and justice. Quran, Surah 5:33 permits execution, crucifixion, or mutilation for crimes like rebellion or theft, while Surah 4:24-2 prescribes 100 lashes for adultery or fornication. And while I agree punishment requires sin, if you look at God's law in the Bible, God never gave undue punishment for a sin that didn't deserve it. God would not take someone who stole something and say, okay, you deserve to be tortured to death like the Quran does. The Quran takes a very rigid, very, very harsh view of justice that you don't find in the Bible. Violence and warfare. Quran, Surah 9:5 commands fighting non-believers under specific conditions, while 47:4 encourages harsh treatment in war. Some verses permit mercy. They don't encourage. They permit mercy and forgiveness, such as Surah 68, but the guidance is not consistent. And overall, it seems that in war they are commanded by the Quran to be harsh and violent. Treatment of non-Muslims, almost done here. Quran chapter 9, verse 29, permits taxing non-Muslims under Islamic rule, and Surah 5:51 warns against preventing Jews and Christians, while 60, verse 8 allows kindness. So what we find there is that non-Muslims are to be viewed as inferior and are to be mistreated and taxed. They're second-class citizens. Non-Muslims in Islam aren't even they don't have the same value as a Muslim would. And then finally, ethical implications. Taken together, women and men are not treated equally. Women are seen as inferior in every single way. Non-Muslims and captives aren't even cared for. In some places, it seems like captives and slaves aren't even viewed as humans, more like commodities. And then the punishments in the Quran are ridiculously harsh and unnecessarily violent. So, even if you accept the Quran as divine, its moral guidance is not aligned with the character of God, or even the character that they claim Allah has. They claim He's the most merciful, and the most kind, the most forgiving. You'll find that all throughout the Quran as you read it. They constantly refer to Allah as the most merciful and most forgiving. But clearly, that is not true. So, in summary, we've taken a very close look at the Quran and some reasons why it's untrustworthy. Number one, the Quran contains so incredibly many contradictions, from theological claims being wrong, cosmology, and creation timelines. And I want to make clear, I found like 80 different contradictions, and I just picked the few that we looked at today as the most, what I felt were the most important to our discussion now. If you do some research, you'll find there are tons of contradictions in the Quran you can find. Number two, many of the stories of the Quran come not from earlier scriptures, but from Gnostic, apocryphal, and local folklore that Muhammad accessed, showing reliance on human sources, not divine revelation. Three, its scientific descriptions reflect ancient mythology, not reality, which contradicts its claim of divine perfection. Finally, the process of its compilation and the existence of multiple textual traditions raise questions about its claim to be perfectly preserved. If the Quran were truly the perfect, preserved revelation of Allah, doesn't it seem that some of these problems I raised wouldn't exist? How could a book that claims to be perfect have all of these problems? That is the question I want to leave you with today. Taken together, these points show the Quran does not meet the standard of flawless divine revelation that Islam claims. Ultimately, I believe I've demonstrated why the foundation of Islam, its core doctrine, its teaching on the Quran, is in fact incorrect. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray to thank you for this day, and thank you for everything you've given us. I pray to thank you for giving me the opportunity to just come do this podcast. I pray that you will please use this podcast wherever you will. Just use it to reach people it needs to reach. And I pray, dear Lord, if there are any unsaved who are watching this episode, that I may not have mentioned salvation directly, but I pray that you will just show them their need for you. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I don't think there's any announcements, nothing coming up in the near future. Just keep an eye out for next month's episode. See you guys then.